Hello, welcome back to part 2 of the figure painting workshop. In this part we're going to do a quick demo. So here you can see I have my canvas open, ready to go, and I also have my reference on a second monitor here, so I'm going to working off of this photo here. This, as I discussed in part 1, is a picture by Anton Belovodchenko, who's an amazing figure photographer. So the link to his website and Instagram are in the description below. But I'll be working off of this first photograph on another monitor. I don't like to have it like too close. Like I don't like them having them side by side because the purpose here isn't so much to measure like against it or to have like, you know, I wouldn't draw, I'm not going to draw a grid or anything. The idea is just to work on my eye and how I sort of decipher proportion, how I measure proportion. Just training my eye to see the proportion and see if I'm making any mistakes. That way, and also it also works your ability to build the figure in a constructed way. Like if you've studied anatomy before, there's a difference between like working on anatomy just as a group of shapes and then actually learning how to build it up sort of from the inside out with simplified three-dimensional boxes or cylinders, or when you get more advanced, like the shape of the rib cage or the pelvis, and how they all fit together. So I'm just keeping that reference photo a little bit away, and I'm not going to zoom in on it or anything. It's just I'm using it as reference, and I'll build up this figure on the canvas and using some constructive anatomy methods. So the first thing I like to do with my canvas is always tone it a little bit, just to not be working on white. I find like I'm sort of working in the evening now, so it's darker, and I like to work in a darker room because there's no glare on the Cintiq. But having like a bright white canvas can kind of throw off, like, well, first it can give you a pretty massive headache after like a couple hours of working with a bright light in your face. But when it comes to painting and judging your tone and your values, working on white can be misleading. Everything can seem sort of too dark because it's in that like white environment. But if you're working on a toned canvas, then it's easier to judge your values. So let's see. I'm just picking any brush now to start sketching out the figure here. So the first lines I'm gonna make I'm gonna try to stay pretty gestural, and not focus too much on proportion. I'm just looking at the line of action and trying to figure out generally where things lay. And in the demo, I probably won't talk as much as I did in the previous episode or the previous part of the workshop, where I went over a lot of different techniques. So this demo, I'll need to focus more on actually painting. So it can be quite difficult to do both at once. So if there's any long spans of silence, feel free to put some music on, or skip through if you want, if you don't like silence that much. But in any case, whenever there's something pertinent to talk about or to discuss, I'll sort of address it. So here I'm just building up, sort of have the general shape of the rib cage under here, and this is the knee coming over the second knee. So the tricky thing about this figure is going to be to maintain balance in the image. So right now she's crouched over and all her weight is on the balls of her feet. And basically the only thing balancing against, if you think of that line being the center of mass, the only thing balancing against this, her rib cage and pelvis, is her head here. That's tilted quite far over. And her head is looking away. So this is going to be a little bit of a tricky angle, but again, I'm not working, or I'm not looking to get exact placements and positions of things for now. I'm just trying to sketch in the general layout. So this knee has to come out a little bit. And I flip my canvas a lot just to make sure that that proportionately things are working and that the whole image is balanced nicely. The rib cage is coming out a little far. Is this always easier to measure stuff against other things? Like distances, it's always easier to divide distances than it is to like multiply. So like a common method to measure the length of things in the human figure is to use like a head unit. So if your head is this tall, you might measure down from that point and say, well, this is one sort of head and two heads and three heads. But the thing is, once you're looking down here, this measurement, to try to measure like with your eye that sort of distance down here, it can start to get pretty difficult compared to if you wanted this to be 4 heads and create another line. It's easier to divide this line in 2 and then divide each section in 2. Your margin for error is going to be a little lower than if you're multiplying. So that's like it's easier to measure stuff once you actually have something on canvas. Like I know now that this rib cage needs to come in. I'm not scared to erase and work over it. It's a beautiful thing about working digitally is that you can always, it's not like paper where the more you erase, the more it sort of messes up your paper. When you're working digitally, you can always go back to a perfectly blank canvas. So use that to your advantage. I'm just going to extend my canvas a little bit to give her some room to breathe. And as I mentioned in the previous part, this is all recorded in real time. So I'm not going to be time-lapsing or speeding anything up. It'll just be real time, so if there's any glitches or anything that pops up, like my skip the dishes notification, there's no way really around that. I'm not going to go through and edit like these hours of footage, just because this is more of a live demo, and you know, it's not worth going through hours and hours of footage to cut out those little things. Okay, so now that I have things sort of roughed in, I can come in and start to refine some of the shapes. So I have a bun. If I pause as well, it's because it's really important to take a step back and just observe, to just like measure with your eye, see what's working, see what the ratios are. An exercise or something I do in my head to measure often is to use a sort of triangle to see what the angle, because with foreshortening, like her arm here is foreshortened, it's sort of coming towards the camera slightly, so it's easy to put the wrong angle on it, like if you were to build it up like this. And the same thing for her forearm here, it's receding into the page, so you don't want to build it out, like it's easy to draw it too long. And to measure those things with my eye, I use this sort of triangle method. So I find the sort of 2 points on the image, and then I see vertically and horizontally what those distances are, and I compare it to like a 45-degree angle triangle. So I know that if that's like a sort of, you know, square triangle, I know if it's shorter or if it's like shorter or longer in whichever direction. And it helps me just place key points and sort of measure them. You know, if this is a little lower than the elbow, or if one knee is higher than the other knee, you can sort of measure it that way. Same thing for using sort of vertical lines to see, like if I want to see if the forehead is hanging over the knee, I know it's hanging over by, you know, that much, and I can sort of see that or measure that with my eye when looking at the photograph. So here the head is a little big. And okay, so now I'm going to come through and lightly erase all of this. I mean, you could also just lower the opacity of the layer and draw on another one, but I kind of like just working on the same layer. And now I'm going to look closer at the contour. So one thing about, I think a really nice anatomy is read in the shapes that you're creating, graphically from like a 2D point of view, but also 3-dimensionally. And for the graphic part of it, it's all about the contour and the silhouette of whatever part of the image you're drawing. So there's the silhouette of the whole figure, like the whole body, and then there's the silhouette of the individual pieces that make it up. And you have to work on the hierarchy and the sort of relationships between those shapes. For instance, when I'm looking at this rib cage, it's not just like a simple, perfectly arcing curve. There's a slight apex to it, where the apex of the curve sort of is around here, and then it drops a little sharply. So, I mean, it's a really subtle difference from this sort of curve to like a perfect like that sort of perfect curve, but having that little like angle here, it really makes the silhouette more interesting, and will make the whole figure seem a little more alive and less like digital or perfectly constructed. Same thing for the shoulders. You can always it's easy to sort of make everything a perfect bump like this. I mean, this is really exaggerated, but doing those sort of bumps or simplifying it too much to like a straight line and a bump, it makes the silhouette really boring. Where if you have some interesting curves that have so if this is a boring curve, an interesting curve has an apex, so like almost like a rounded triangle. So just keeping all those curves a little more interesting can make a huge difference in how your silhouette reads. And also in this sketching stage, I'm focusing on like the quality of the line that I'm putting down. So really, this is just working a lot of different things. It's working your draftsmanship. It's putting your anatomy knowledge to the test. Indicating bony landmarks, muscle groups. The tricep, the bicep, where the shoulder or the deltoids will insert. So all those things are just indicated. And in the sketching process, I'm not doing it for the drawing purpose of it. I'm doing it, it's a delineation of the form that will just help me in the painting process. So I just want to indicate enough so that when I start painting, there's something to go off of. So here, the wrist. So I'll also indicate like really slight, like this line here is an indication of where the core shadow is on the forearm. So things like shadow shapes. Here the scapula sort of wrapping under the armpit, and this is pretty significantly occluded area here. Happening here. And then the lat, the latissimus dorsi, is sort of crossing the rib cage. So you have your obliques under here. But this line is sort of it's not like a hard line. It's just like a bump. So I'll just indicate that. And then there's a couple ribs in here. And I'll also just block in some quick shapes of value. Mostly just indicating where the core shadow is. And one of the most important parts to give structure to is like the knuckle and the joint areas, so knees, elbows, knuckles, wrists, because that's where most of the muscles will either start or terminate, and you have a lot of ligaments and you have a lot of bones that sort of protrude. So giving the knee a little bit of structure instead of it being perfectly round makes it more of like a bony knee than like a soft jelly bean knee. The calf is sort of peeking out. And in this drawing, or for this figure, I'm going to concentrate most of my efforts on a couple places, and I'm making some mental notes as I'm drawing to see what I want to concentrate on and what I want to bring more contrast and more attention to. So this area here, so there's a hand that's reaching out under, sort of like this, which I'm going to have to add in. But that hand and this foot, which is catching a little bit of light just on the bottom, that's going to sort of be like one area of more high density detail. This elbow here is going to be the brightest part of the image, followed by the tendons and muscles in the neck, which are pretty prominent. And then the head, like this whole area here, is all gonna like recede into the background, is gonna be pretty dark in value, and so will the sort of this back leg. And I'm just indicating the structure of this foot under here before drawing the hand, so that once I cover it, there's actually still a foot under there. Like I know that there's a foot, because if I were to draw the hand, I could draw the foot all wonky and something would look wrong, but you might not realize why, because you didn't take the time to draw the structure underneath. So one of the best books I read on constructive anatomy is our Bridgman's books. So I think he has one. I have them in my shelf somewhere. Here. There. So shameless, not a shameless plug, but yeah. So this book here, Constructive Anatomy, by George Bridgman, heads, features, and faces, as well as just learning the Loomis method for heads. And then the human machine is also really, really good, because it really discusses the sort of mechanical nature of the body and how things function, which is really important when you're doing constructive anatomy, because you develop like a deeper understanding of how things move, what the function of tendons and muscles are, and how they insert, how they like attach to the muscle, and how like different tissues will sort of bind groups of muscles together, and that really can all that knowledge can be applied when you're rendering a figure, because the figure is always, like, muscles move around. It's very like the human body is very elastic, and so as the body moves, you can sort of judge or place muscles more accurately, and bring a little more justice to the function of the body, make it feel a little more alive. Here, foot is in really deep shadow, so you can't even see it. Here's a pretty sharp line for a cast shadow casted. And here. I'm also trying to make sure that there aren't any tangents. Sometimes in your reference you can have things like if the line of the bicep here were to terminate right where the hand meets the knee, those are sort of tangents that you want to avoid as much as possible. Same thing, like if this arm here were to intersect tangent to the knee, you'd want to avoid that, because it just becomes distracting, and avoiding those will just make your image more legible. It'll make the arm feel independent of the hand and the knee. I'm just moving my reference around. I zoomed in just a little bit on it, just so that I can see what's happening with the shapes. This is too strong. And all these things are, I'm drawing them in now, but they'll definitely change as I paint. I'll adjust the silhouette mostly, and work the forms inside. Here you have sort of the traps that connect high on the neck, and then this muscle here, which is attaching behind the ear, is the sternocleidomastoid. It's an awesome word to say. Always, never gets old. But that muscle is really prominent once you turn your neck, and she's turning it pretty like abruptly, so that muscle is very prominent, and there's a really sharp shadow underneath. So I'll indicate that, and then jugular here. So under here there's like the clavicle and stuff and where the shoulder connects, but I'm not going to really indicate too much of that because it's in very deep shadow. But I'm going to try to work on the shape of this head a little bit. I'm not, as you saw from the reference page, or the reference that I showed, the head is turned away, and in these figure demos, most of the models I'm using as reference either have their head tilted down or away, or they're facing away from the camera. And that's just because I really want to focus these demos on building the anatomy and that part of figurative drawing and less on portraiture. I might do a portraiture demo later, another time. We'll see how this sort of series goes. But it's a whole other subject. But really, it comes down to the same thing. I mean, you're judging shapes against other shapes. Like, it's easy to think that, like, because it's a face, there's something special about it, but there really isn't. There's an underlying structure like every other part of the body, and if you get that structure right, if you nail that structure, and you nail your values and all that stuff, it'll look like a face. It'll look like a head. No, as I'm talking, I'm making mistakes, which I probably wouldn't normally make, because talking is distracting. There's going to be some dark tones here. Also, I'm trying to keep this at a pretty decent page. These are demos. They're not, this isn't like a personal illustration or anything. It's really just an exercise. So, I'm not looking for perfection, just looking for volume. And, alright, so we'll start with that. As a sort of delineation of the figure. And we'll adjust as we go with the values. So once you have your sketch down, I have my basic forms, my basic indications of shapes. I'm not going to really draw in the hands and feet right now. I'll just indicate them once I'm painting. But you know, the main part of the anatomy is down, and it's time to move on to the next step. So once I have my drawing down, so this is all it's just black transparent pixels on top of gray. So I like to fill in, sort of mask out the whole figure with a flat value, just so that as I lay colors or lay values on top, it has something to snap onto. The last thing you really want is work your whole illustration transparently, or maybe you do. I mean, maybe that's just your technique, but I like to keep have an opaque mask. It just makes colorizing the image later, because this will all be done in black and white before adding color. It just helps that process and helps bring the figure off the page. I'm blocking it in with a pretty opaque brush. And once you block it in, that's also a really good time to see if the overall shapes are working nicely, or if you missed anything, or check if your weight is working properly. And this is sort of a quick and dirty mask. You can always adjust the silhouette. We'll refine a lot as we go along. But it's all about working up to that level of final detail and all the nuances and stuff. Because if you start detailing right off the bat, you might completely overlook the structure of your figure, and overlook things like perspective and proportion and all that stuff. So we want to try to address most of that at the beginning, and then focus on detail later. Okay, so now I'm gonna jump to that round brush I was using in part 1, which is just a sort of 50% hardness round brush with a little bit of texture. The texture really doesn't matter that much, like what exactly the texture is. It could be a canvas texture. This is sort of like a rock texture. It's just noise basically, because the mix of having a little bit of noise and a little bit of feathering in the edge of the brush helps blending like tremendously. If you just had a smooth brush, it's easier to see the sort of lines of the brush strokes. So yeah, so I'm just using this basic brush here. Actually, even for the first part, oh no, I'll just stick to that brush, whatever. And I'm gonna go on below my lines, because these lines I want to conserve them just as a guide, and on the layer below, I'm gonna create a clipping mask that clips to the block in that I did below, and what that clipping mask does is whatever I draw on that layer, it's only gonna draw on the pixels of the layer below it. So as I'm blocking, and I don't have to worry about painting outside the lines or anything like that. So what value is this? So I'm gonna bring this tone up a little bit, closer to like 50% gray, as I discussed, because that's going to be the local value of the skin. And I'm going to work lighter and darker on top of that 50% tone, because there's like a shorter distance, you know, that you only have to go 25% up and 25% down instead of starting at white and then having to go all the way down to like 80% to black. So okay, so I like to indicate my highlights first. So here we go. And I have my flow down to 30% here, as you can see. So all those, it's really about building up. I don't want to go back on my strokes too much, just for the sake of being faster and just not, you know, wasting time fixing mistakes. This really comes down to just having a good amount of brush control, indicating that ridge of the ribs. And there's a brighter highlight here. And this is where I'm going to start to indicate all the different things we talked about in part 1, like the pokes and the pinches and the dips and ridges and creases and all those things. It really comes down to sculpting the form with light. So this as a note, my light source is coming from this direction. Over the shoulder. I'll just keep that there as a reminder for you more than for me, but as I lay down the light on the form, I'm thinking of like what's blocking it. Obviously I'm referring to my reference, but I think practically or pragmatically, like how is the light getting to those areas, and what is causing the shadows, etc. Is it the form that's curving away from the light, or is it a cast shadow? I almost think of light, or I really like to think of light as sort of a really powerful like rain. So if you've ever seen like it rain sideways, or it during a big thunderstorm, and rain falls parallel. So if you have an umbrella, for instance, and the rain is going straight down, then below the umbrella you'll have a dry spot on the ground, and with light, that dry spot is your shadow. So you can think of light as like falling onto the object, and whatever's blocking that light, it's going to create a shadow, like a dry area, absent of light, because you're not really adding shadow, or you're just taking away light, right? The only reason you can see anything is because light is getting to your eye. So building up the form that way and thinking like how is the light getting to that area, can really help. Or I think it's a little more intuitive than to say like add shadow, because adding shadow is just adding an absence of light. Yeah, don't be scared to go all in with your values when you're blocking in. To be confident, and because you can always go over, right? It's not destructive. If I wanted to add pure white over this, I could totally do it. But there's just the advantage of working digitally, is that it's just more flexible. So use that to your advantage, to be confident with your mark making, and build up those forms. Because if you go too light with your shadows and too dark with your highlights because you're being timid or something, it'll really wash out the depth. But obviously, there's a limit. You don't want to go straight to black and straight to white. As we discussed, the conserving your value range is also really important. And honestly, when blocking in these values, it can almost be detrimental to think too much about what you're trying to illustrate. Like if you think you're trying to make a leg, then you might revert to the sort of iconography or the sort of image in your head of what you think a leg is, where when you're blocking these values, it's really important to just look at your reference and see what's causing that area to be dark, and what shape is, what the shape is, and then laying the appropriate value on your canvas. Because if you do that right, then it'll look like a leg. So there's a core shadow here, and then there's some reflected light coming underneath, and we have You can already see how this is starting to build up the form around the knees. You have a very occluded area here. And the calf. There's some compression happening. So this is going to be a pretty sharp crease. We have the light on one side and dark on the other. And then, because the form is rounding off, I don't want to go too bright. This is what shows the sort of relief of the thigh. And then there's some occlusion that's happening around this intersection here. So I'm not going to paint any of that white in. And some of the muscles under here, a little bit of a soft bump, and then some occlusion around the bottom, which will really help the form turn away from the camera. Another thing I'm going to do right now is darken my background, because the background on my reference is quite dark, but I also, just in general, I like to keep my background pretty close, like around 80% gray, and have a little bit of some fartsy brush strokes or whatever. But it's just to give me something, a value to work against, as I'm laying down the values on the figure. So then I can judge against that color. And I'll just check. So I'm going to brighten it just a little bit, because I want the most occluded. Basically, I want the value of my background to be just a little bit lighter than the darkest darks, that are going to be the sort of occluded areas around the silhouette of the figure. So around the butt here, and over the shoulder, and the silhouette of the head here, they're going to be the darkest parts, and the arm. And I want my background to be a touch lighter. So I'm going to keep it at that, because I'm still conserving my darkest darks and my brightest brights for the end. You want to build up that tonal range. And I'm just going to continue on this. So what I mean is, like here, if I use just a soft brush, I want that to be the sort of the darkest I go, so that there's some contrast happening. It sort of creates the illusion that there's space around the figure when it contrasts in different ways. Here we have dark against light, and here we have light against dark. Relatively. So it sort of creates space around the figure. And this whole area here is going to be quite dark. So you can see here I had only laid in lighter value, and now I'm going over and laying in some darker value. So I'm just accentuating or pushing that tonal range. And I still have my my lines above, because you see, if I don't have my lines anymore, it's really hard to sort of fill in this void. But with those lines, they're just guides, and until I block in all the values, I'll keep those lines as guides, and then start to work on top of those lines to sort of paint them out and refine my edges, make sure I have some really sharp edges and some lost edges, and work the figure to its final stage. Crease. And the light sort of just peeking out, because these forms are, so this elbow right here is going to be the highest contrast area of the whole figure. Especially this one core shadow is going to be quite dark against the tendons and muscles that wrap around this one little bony landmark right here. But I won't concentrate too much on that right now, because I need to get the rest of this in. So I'm pressing quite hard, and it's because my flow is turned all the way down. But here, if I don't have to press so hard, my flow's at 100% to lay down these blocking shapes. And then here, I have the high contrast area, because this is really dark. This I need to fix. So you can see my line here on the shoulder. I had drawn it here, where it should actually be there. So I'll just fix that in this blocking stage. And we have a sharp form shadow of the shoulder. Crease in the neck, and then here. And the hair has a darker local value than the skin, so it's okay to push that a little more towards the darks, as long as you reserve enough tonal range to still show the form, right? So like the lightest light here is going to be around 80% gray, and the darkest darks are going to get quite close to black, but you'll still be able to show form just with that 20% span of values. And then finally, have back of the neck, which is picking up quite a bit of light, and the ear. So this is basically the block-in. Actually, I haven't done the feet. Let's do. It's going to be like this, and then you're going to have basically a lost edge from one foot to the other. Hand underneath here is picking up some reflected light, and there's a little part on the side of the foot here that's picking up a little, or catching a little light. This here's going to be occluded. This is all the stuff I'm mumbling is stuff I'm thinking about in a non-explicit way, but 1, 2 toes. I neglect toes. I neglect feet. I always have. So big toe, 1, 2, 3, 4. Small toes. Okay. Make sure I get all those in. I'll come back and refine the shape of that foot. But here we've got a lot of like little creases and stuff, which I'm not going to work on right now because it's not there yet. Got to be patient. And I'm going to do the same for the hand. So here this area gets quite occluded, and this is where I'll switch out from that textured brush and just use like a soft brush if I really need to tone down a whole area or in a soft way. I'll just use this round brush or soft round to just introduce some darker tone, and this can really help make your figure turn by just blending that out softly. Okay, so now we basically have all our values, our value structure set up. So now we can go back in over top and start refining. So this would be our blocking, and now we're going in and sort of modeling out all the different shapes, the secondary shapes, in more detail, and working on more of the subtleties of the forms on the surface. And I like to sort of scan over, like, so if I start like in this area, I like to sort of start here and then move like along the limbs and go sort of all the way around my figure until I've covered everything, and until moving to the later stage. And if I notice any big mistakes, I can, there's no attachment. You can always go in and cut things, move things around. These are studies, right? You're training your eye. So, anything goes when it comes to fixing things, and yeah, just making sure you get it as right as you can. So I'm going to merge that down. I'll create another layer on top. I like to work with as few layers as possible, because having a big layer stack stresses me out. I'm just thinking of it. some of the people I've worked with in the past who can have like 2 bazillion layers for like a sketch. Actually, I'm gonna work on that layer just so that if I need to refine things in the silhouette, I can do that. I will have to pay a little closer attention to not going outside my lines. You can see this, I'm creating really subtle dips, right? Really subtle creasing, just keeping in mind my form. And as we went over in part 1, it's important to respect the value structure of the location you're in, or of the area you're working on. So in the block-in, I've established that value structure to a certain point, and so as I'm working back into these areas, I just want to respect that as much as possible and color pick from around that area. So if I'm working on an area that's facing the light overall, even if there's dips and ridges and things going on with more subtle surface things that are going on with the form, you really want to stick to overall brighter colors, right? Oh wait, I said I was going to keep that for you guys. Here I'm getting close to my lightest lights, but you see I'm just creeping up so that I don't overshoot things. And then there's a very subtle shape change. If I exaggerated it, it would be sort of a blocky shape for the bicep, because the pressure of the knee is pushing against the bicep. And there's a really, really subtle ridge right here before it intersects with the forearm. You just want to show with a slight drop in value, and then bump it up. I really like to push the impression of the anatomy on figures. Just slight exaggerations here and there. There's a harsh drop shadow. Just refining some of that silhouette. And here I'm locking my layer. You can see I'm locking the pixels of my layer, so this is sort of like a clipping mask where whatever you've already put on the canvas will stay locked and you can't draw outside of those pixels. So I'm using that to add a little highlight ridge along the back of the neck. So I'm starting outside and working in and then dragging out and tapering it off that way. And this is basically the longest part of making the figure read, and it's the part that you either love it or you hate it, but I absolutely love it. So I could spend ages, just working the shapes, making sure that all the edges, I control every edge, whether it's a hard edge or a soft edge. Because there's all sorts of complex overlaps happening in the muscle groups, and I'm trying to tackle all those things at once. So here, all those muscles, you start to have a drop shadow from the head, or cast shadow from the head, and then occlusion that's happening behind the ear. Especially here, which is a pretty significant form change. This one. Turn my flow even lower, which is more forgiving. You can press harder, because I want to lay these strokes down in a really transparent way. But with my flow turned up, it can be hard to control that, so just dropping it down to make my life a little easier. There you go. I want to bump up the overall value of this area. So I'm going with a brush, a soft brush, and just glaze over everything. Something about this arm isn't quite right. So I'm going to, basically to do this transformation, so I need to make it a little broader and come up a little bit on the figure. But so I just select the piece I want to transform and duplicate it, and then I'll warp it. So basically I can change the shape of it this way, and so I want to bring it up on the figure and make it a little more a little more broad. Something like that. And so that's the change I want to make. And now you can see it creates all these nasty edges here. So I'll just go in with a soft eraser and go over that just to blend it back into what I had underneath. So now that change is, you know, there's some things to clean up still, but it's less of an issue. Had a whole bunch of Chinese food for supper. My stomach feels like a rock. I was just using a soft round there to do some soft changes in the form, but don't want to spend too much time doing that, just because it loses its can sort of like end up airbrushing everything out, and then it loses that sort of skin texture that you get from building stuff up with the with brushes. I also like to work from what's behind to what's in front, because you can be a little sloppier with your marks. You know, if I go over this, and because I just want dark here, I can always go over the leg and clean up that line with you know, with a sharper mark. But so yeah, that's fine. Still on the back here, I'm creating just some subtle highlights for the ribs that are showing up. In this figure, they're just quite thin, and like athletic. She has a more athletic build, so so the obliques, and especially around the ribs, in the back, you can see there's a lot more of the skeleton showing through. Some of it is our bones, some of it is muscle, but you'll see on certain figures that you know, all humans deposit fat in different ways. Some gain it around the waist, some gain it in your belly or on the legs more than the upper body. So you just have to pay attention to that on your reference to make those calls. So here, there's an interesting mark here where it just gets darker, and it seems like it for almost no reason. But this is where the obliques are connecting to the pelvis. So there's a little dip, and this is where having a basic knowledge of anatomy can really help create a sense of believability when you're painting figures and realism, is that if you're just going off the reference blindly, you might put down marks and you don't understand why they're there. Where if you have like a basic knowledge of skeletal and muscular anatomy, then when you're laying down a random bump, it's not so random anymore, and you can adjust accordingly with the if it's a bump that's caused by a bone that's protruding, you might accentuate it or exaggerate it. If it's just a muscle, you might choose not to exaggerate it. But it really comes down to like what you're trying to show in your figure. I'm just going over this line because the top of the thigh here, and I don't want to create a straight line. I want to dip it down, back up again. But top of this thigh is basically facing the light directly, so there's going to be quite a sharp, bright line, but only on the very edge of it. Everything else it'll fade off pretty quickly. And I mean, you could like create a selection and work off of it like this, but there's value in just learning how to control your brush, how to blend things at different scales, whether it be a large scale on the thigh or at a small scale like this bridge, because I'm basically creating a very short, like a brief gradient from here to here, to get a really sharp differentiation between the top of the thigh and the ribs behind it. And then at the top here, these areas can get tricky because they're lighter, but they're occluded, but you have like a mix of all sorts of shadows and stuff happening. It'd be hard to figure out what's causing it all. But and then the same thing here, right, for the calf. There's some compression happening in between the muscle of the muscles in the thigh. And actually I should save this. But yeah, so there's a sharp contrast between the muscles of the thigh and the calf, but it'll only show up like really close to that intersection, and everything leading up to it will be quite soft, like a softer gradient. Because gradients don't always have to be like a perfect gradual, like every 5 pixels it drops from one tone or something like it. There can be changes in like the speed of the gradient. So around the edges, it'll sort of get exponentially brighter as the form turns completely tangent. And then you have your IT, I think it's the IT band, connects to your femur bone, or it kind of draws around it, but the femur sort of protrudes out and can push those muscles around the hip out, which is why you get this little bump happening. And then there's a nice amount of reflected light coming off the ground here. So have a nice core shadow here, and then the reflected light. And you can see that having that little bit of texture, it really helps to like sell the idea of it might be pores, it might be like really thin hairs or something, but just to sell the texture of the skin. And then here, I'm also going to want to accentuate the core shadow just a little bit. So you can see what's happening now with this side of the figure that's starting to get a little more refined. And the form here is starting to read a little better. Whoops. Off my figure. So there. Okay. Now, okay, so now I'm going to focus on the elbow here and the knee, which is basically the focal area, the areas of highest contrast. And I just want to make sure that those secondary forms are in the right place, and that there's no sort of banding going on. If you have like you don't want any distracting patterns, like where bumps repeat regularly, or the scale of things repeat regularly. So here you have a bump here, and then you have a bump there. You don't want it to be them all to be the same size in the reference. They aren't, but when you interpret it, you can sort of. We always have tendencies to create patterns and to simplify things, where in reality, the figure is very complex. There's all these like nuances, and everything has a purpose, like a function. So you just want to pay attention to those things. A little bit of reflected light underneath. This is going over the elbow, and then you have a small core shadow. And I'm going this much in detail only in this area because it is the focal point, so I'm quite zoomed in. These decks are going to get quite dark. Because contrast will draw your eye to that area. If you don't want, if you have an ugly part in your image, make sure it's really low contrast. Some reflected light underneath. It's quite occluded, but there is also reflected light on the leg. So I just want the leg to be overall darker than the reflected light under the elbow, so that it really comes forward. Here is a strong cast shadow from the arm, which is also going to bring it forward, because this shadow being really dark against the brightness of the arm will it's high contrast. So and one thing about the way the figure in this photo is lit is I think it's lit by either a small light or a slightly diffused light, because the edges of the cast shadows are pretty soft compared to the cast shadows you get from sunlight, for instance. Because if you look at objects in the daylight, the sun is really, really big, even though it's super far and it seems small in the sky. It's really big, and the light rays are coming basically parallel to one another. So when it hits an object, you have a moment where either it hits the object and then right after it doesn't, so you get a really sharp shadow like that. But if your light source is small, and let's say you have the same object, it's a point light, for instance, and I mean, you have more scattering that happens in the shadow, or if the if the light is really big, is bigger than your object, and it's sort of scattering from all over the place. So here you'll have multiple areas that will hit your shadow. So you basically get a feathered shadow. So I think that's what's happening here. Maybe he's using a softbox, or I don't know much about photography. I have to get into that a little bit more, but and here I want to go light on the calf, but I don't want to go as bright as this area up here, and I definitely don't want to go as bright as the elbow up here, because it is still slightly occluded by being under the leg, under the thigh. And then this shadow here is going to come up. Okay, I'm zooming out just to judge and see where I'm at. So stuff like this hard edge here is going to have to go, and this is going to have to be more defined, and this whole area is going to have to darken up quite a bit, as well as this, to push it back. Okay, let's continue on the elbow. Sometimes I get ghost layers like this and I don't know what they are. I just create them and leave them for eternity. Like this here, that line I just drew in is not supposed to be like a line. It's a really short gradation, to show that the form is quickly quickly turning away from the camera. for turning away from the light. So I try to fade out the one edge. And there's a sharp crease happening right here. Lowering or making my brush smaller so that I can get a sharper line. Bring this knee forward. Just refine the edge. Short split. The tricep connects to the back of the elbow, or where the so here you have a muscle group that comes and wraps around here, and you have the tricep connects under the deltoid here, and then this is your bicep here. So this tendon here, there's some stuff, some muscle stuff happening here. I don't know exactly what all the muscle groups are called, or the back of this is, but I know that this is a muscle wrapping around. This is the insertion of a certain muscle. So. Okay, so that's reflected light, and so we have a really occluded area under here. I'm gonna go really dark. Darker than I'd ever go for a figure that's just standing or something, because it's crouched over, so these areas are really recessed. Actually, this area is background. That makes sense. Okay, it's just the background and the reference is very right. I was wondering, I'm like, man, that torso is really wide, but here. The drop shadow of the bicep. Some reflective light. Note, shadow areas are much less important to define than areas in the light, because the areas in the light are, because it's the light that shows the form, not the shadows, if that makes sense. The lack of light doesn't show the form. The light that actually gets to you is what shows the form. So if this was just an amorphous dark shape, the overall figure would still read quite well, and a lot of artists do that as a as just an artistic strategy, or it might be a stylistic choice, or whatever it is. I like to define what shapes are happening under here, because I think it pushes the form back even further. But if this was just a really dark shape, it would read just the same. So here, there's the clavicle, and then the darkest area of the shoulder. I want these value changes to be really subtle. I mean, you're looking at like 1 or 2% difference between these, but it's enough that at a distance you still see the change. You still see what's going on here, and you can see if it's wrong. Because if you make that area too high contrast, then it jumps out at you. This muscle in here, and then I'll soften this up because this has a little too much texture. There's a little light catching in the back of the jaw. Form quickly turns, and you get the drop shadow of the ear. I always say drop shadow. It's a cast shadow. Drop shadow is like the effect that you put on text in a 2000s PowerPoint presentation. I mean, I guess it's the same thing, but I think the proper terminology is just a cast shadow. And I'm going to give a little structure to the ear. And I mean, a note on, I tend to stylize things slightly. I'm aware if things are slightly exaggerated in areas, or if my rendering or something is stylized. Like, I know. I'm not searching for photorealism. I just want to give the impression that the shape is very three-dimensional, and I'm looking for the appeal of the shapes. More than the realism or the that's gonna be okay. So the cheek, a little structure, and then there's a part of the nose here. It peeks out. Some reflected light. That's pretty much all I'm going to do for the head. Just indicate. Just give enough information to say that there's a face happening there. Reflected light under the cheek. Okay. Moving down the arm so I can get to the knee. And still been some more checklist. Okay. So this is pretty much the brightest part of the image. There's a pretty sharp highlight here. I'm just going to indicate that, and then there's a pretty bright ridge happening, which will really bring that knee forward. And that, with the contrast of this cast shadow here of the arm, we'll make sure to give that shadow a little bit of form. So it's not just a perfect line. Nor is it perfectly sharp. So it fades off quite quickly. But the bottom of it, it fades into reflected light here at the bottom. So I want to keep the core shadow right in this fold. And this area here is going to make a cast shadow again. This is where the cast shadow continues. And then this blends out really quickly into the core shadow of the calf. Now, shadows don't multiply on top of each other. So if you have a cast shadow that bleeds into a form shadow, that they'll merge. They won't, like, you would never have a cast shadow that sort of, so if this whole area is in shadow, even if there's reflected light in here, you won't have the shadow like continue like that. It doesn't multiply over. So it just it just fades into, it becomes the form shadow. Like I said, like it's not about adding shadow, it's about taking away light. So once you take away all the light, you can't like take it away again. If that makes sense. And you can occlude it. You can occlude shadow areas even more. So basically taking the reflected light away. But I mean, once all the light's taken away, it's black. It's an abyss. And here, so this here between the two legs is a completely lost edge. Calf here creates a little bit of form, but it quickly fades away to nothing. So see how that really brings the knee forward in space. Now, bring it forward even more. I need to work on the bottom area here. So this comes up. Then there's the so basically the calf shape is here, and I need to create a sort of crease happening in between the knee and the calf. So I need to raise this area here and keep my core shadow. And then these two melt together. So like weird junctions of the anatomy, where all sorts of complex shapes come together, and sometimes you just need to spend a little more time and figure out how things are working. So this is the reflected light under the calf. We're just creating a crease against the tibia. And this is all going to fade just into darkness. I don't need to not much more. And then this is going to be really occluded as well. No, actually, I want to darken this whole area because this reflected light is getting pretty bright. Something like that. Sorry. I don't know why my Photoshop does that. It just spazzes out sometimes and it's like, everything you're clicking is wrong. Okay, now there's the core shadow, which is really what's going to bring the knee forward. Right here, it's quite sharp. And this is a lost edge with the elbow behind. That's my textured round brush. And here there's, this is the, no, so, okay, so, this is where the sort of tendons of the quads are attaching over the knee. And then the patella, which is your kneecap, is reflecting just a tiny bit of light under here. Too bright. Okay, and then let's make this whole area just a little bit brighter. So something else you can do to make areas almost glow. I like to make skin that's almost like silk, where it almost glows, and you can do that by adding like a little bit of bloom almost. So bloom is when light sort of scatters over a dark background, so basically that's bloom, this sort of glow around. And by adding a really subtle amount, so this arm here is quite dark, it's also quite small. I'm going to fix that real fast. Okay, so yeah, so this arm is quite dark, and so is the background. So I can add a little bit of just a soft sort of glow to these areas, and it'll almost make them feel like they're glowing. But that comes later. There's still some stuff to work on here. Okay, wrist and hand area. Generally, in figures, the face and the hands are the areas that attract the most attention, because hands are very gestural in themselves. You know, you can show a lot of expression, and you can tell a lot with hands on like how the person is feeling, or you can tell a pretty extensive story just with the gesture of the hands. But And then of course with the face, the face is very expressive and it's what will attract your eye hands down the most when you have a face, because this image doesn't really have a face. But the face and the hands are what you would normally spend the most time on, and try to get the most detail in, because that's how you're telling the story of the figure. But in this case, the only real hand is down here, and it's quite occluded. I mean, we will focus on it in a bit. But this hand here going over the knee, you only see this sort of back of the wrist. And a little bit of a crease here. That in there. And then we'll get a little bit more of a core shadow here. And cast shadow until you have this is basically the back of the pinky, sort of palm part, pinky side of the palm. And then you'll get a sharp bone here. And you have a little bit of a cast shadow. A bit of a dip in the arm. This part, there's something weird with this shoulder. There's definitely some. Okay, so this. Okay, so I guess this is a good time to talk about liquifying. But if you find there's a mistake like this, and I'll explain once I get into the liquify. But this area is wrong. What I need to fix it to. So if my rib cage the top of my rib cage is here, and it's sort of like an egg shape, and then the shoulder blades are sort of curving around the back, so my shoulder sockets are here, but this armpit should be closer into where the rib cage is, and the arm should be leaning out like this, rather than going in and out like that, if that's like an exaggerated version of what it is. So I'm going to bring this filter liquify, and I'm just going to take this edge and sort of model it around where I want it to be. And know that I have to make the arm a little thicker too. Bring the bump out, the shoulder, and do a little something like this. And while I'm in here, I'll also adjust a couple of these shapes. This whole thing is going to have to goes in like that. Okay. Drop peak of this knee. Okay. So here there's a couple soft creases, which I'll just indicate with a few really soft brush strokes. Clean those out. And we're sort of struggling a bit with this area to show the how the shoulder wraps around, because the shoulder connects to the clavicle up here like that, and the pec goes underneath. So I'm trying to show that sort of that subtle transition in anatomy and like the subtle overlapping of the muscles, but it's hard when your values are this compressed, but something like this. Like really subtle creases. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I need to introduce a bit of a sharper edge to this cast shadow. Yeah, keep it like that. Okay, now down here. Hand, and then we'll do a little bit of hair and go on to color. Just a quick and dirty way. At this point, I think we're an hour in or a couple hours in. I'm not sure, I haven't really been keeping track, but it's starting to get a little tired. And I want to cheat. Okay. Because I do want to do this in one sitting, but there's still color to do, and because I'm talking, I've done some mistakes and I've had to work over stuff. You know, it might not show, but normally I can get these figures done in like a couple hours, fully rendered. Let's just lock that. Okay, let's focus on this hand. So, the index, sort of pressing into the leg, and then thumb is in deep shadow here, in the back, and there's the coarse shadow of the index knuckle, the phalanges. This gets pretty dark. The wrist. And then there's the core shadow of the second knuckle. The ring finger, and then the light of the ring finger only pops up because there's the cast shadow of the index. And the second joint. It's a little longer. And there's a cast shadow of the middle finger. And then the ring finger is tucked behind it, and the pinky is on the bottom. Okay. You can see just with those couple lines, you can already define you can always see a hand. And that's the thing with trying to draw what you think of being a hand is, and actually drawing what the hand looks like in your references. It's really just a group of shapes of values, and not necessarily the icon, like the iconographic. It's not the icon of a hand. It's not it's not like finger, thumb. Like, you're not delineating all those elements. You're just lighting the forms of them. So I will bring a little bit of contrast to this area, just because I still like to look at hands. So get just a tiny bit of light on this ring finger. It's almost impressionistic, where you're just giving a little stroke of light, where you want to show that little form is popping out, and all the rest is just, it can be pretty not jumbled, but morphic. Let's make it quite dark as well. Building up to this darker tone, so I can reveal the thumb. And this is where your resolution starts to limit you in a good way, because if I zoom in anymore, I start to get pixelation. I mean, maybe not for a bit, like maybe not until, like here, do I actually start to see pixels, but you don't want to be in here, like, working on the finger, because you don't know what you're doing, like, on the larger scale of things, so you might just you might be putting too much contrast, or pushing the values too far away from what they need to be in their context. So making the hand slightly bigger, and have to blend that out. Starting to make all these little mistakes by not paying attention. Pay attention. There's only an hour left to this demo, maybe, hopefully. I do enjoy this though. Like, I mean, I'm not getting impatient or anything. There's some nice creases happening where the toes bend around. So using the techniques we looked at in part 1, creating the folds. I'm just going to indicate those quickly in here. Quickly now. In front of the toes are facing away. Big toe actually is almost completely in shadow. All this is going to melt into the cast shadow of the whole figure, which I'm going to put in right now. So pick this darker tone here, and actually I'll use an let's use this brush here. It's a square, so I can let's introduce maybe it's the ground texture or something. This is basically going to be a more brush mark oriented version of the shadow that I see in my reference. Soften this out a little bit. The only part I'm really worrying about is how it intersects with the toes or the feet. There you go. That dark. I'm just going to melt these together. Okay, let's do that for now. And this, I'm also going to that a little bit. And just reveal like there's some light hitting the ground so that the shadow pops a little more. That's the background and the shadow. Okay, let's get into okay, so there's couple things I want to adjust on this, which I'll do in liquify because the balance isn't quite working. So first things first, this needs to come down. This needs to be a little flatter, come in slightly, and this needs to be a little wider. This needs to come down over. I just need to paint the shape of that head a little differently. This whole thing needs to come up. head. Sharpen up this ear. What's going on? There's a little earring. Add a little bright highlight, just to bring some attention to it. And here, let's work on the hair a little bit. So I'm gonna change brushes to something that's a little more streaky. And I'm gonna indicate some strands of hair. And this is nice. The nice thing about this brush is with the tilt shift, I can change the angle of it as I tilt my brush, and or lean my brush over onto one side or another, so I have a lot of control over the direction of the streakiness when I add in these shapes. Some flyaways. I just want to indicate the hair quickly. I don't want to go too overboard. Get some bright highlights here and there. So look here. Tilt my brush over to the other side. I have more control over the shape of the stroke that I'm putting down. Get at these flyaways. Hair is really about building it up in layers to show that there's depth to the haircut, and building up in hierarchy so that you have big and small shapes. And sort of working with these faster strokes. Highlight on top of the bun, and have a nice sharp shadow to complement that. Something like that. And then the front of this is going to have to move it off a little bit. Actually, one thing I do want to do is go pretty dark, and it's because I want to give that hair a little bit of a glossy feel to it. So I'm just going to go around the core shadow of that hair and sharpen, darken things up. I'm sort of having a hard time seeing it because it's quite dark, and I have a sort of desk light so that you don't only see my face through the glow of my screen. So it's causing a little bit of glare, but it's manageable. And you have these sort of baby hairs underneath. Hair is one of my favorite things to paint. It's so abstract, and you can have so much fun with the shapes of the strokes that you're putting down, and every stroke counts. Compared to if you're drawing like an arm or something, you have to be pretty, like the musculature and the anatomy is more important than the or it's equally as important as the shapes, but I think when I'm working on hair, it's just a little more freeing. I think it's nice to be able to work with soft and hard edges. If you really want to make it shine, you can go in with an overlay layer and a soft brush and just bring in some white and just go over your highlight. I didn't mean to, it's an eraser. Just go over your highlighted region. Just make them things like that. Man, I could obsess over this for like another hour, but I need to go to bed soon. So I'm just gonna fix a couple more things, and then we'll do color. So that's a little better, and then I'm just gonna include a chin here. Include that, and the feet do need some love. So there's a bone protruding here, an ankle, and then there's a cow shadow of the hand. Over, and then core shadow, form shadows of the ankle are dropping down. And you have a couple jumbly shapes, which are basically the bones and the veins and stuff that you'd see on the top of your foot. And then you have the sort of pads of the foot. And the sides here are quite occluded. And go. Didn't do that right. So. Little toe. Create a soft transition to the shadow, and then that has a cast shadow onto the ring toe. There's only the little toe and the big toe, and all the toes in between, they don't really have names. Maybe the middle toe, but I mean, they have names, they have scientific names, I just don't know them. So I call them the ring toe and the index toe. Honestly, after a couple hours of recording and talking to yourself, you start to feel a little loopy, but I think I'll get used to it. So I've been talking to an imaginary audience. So just consider that. I don't know if you guys are falling asleep or not. Here. That's it. So just like the fingers on the hand, toes are about giving the impression that they're there and not necessarily about delineating all of them individually. That's a little better. A little bit of volume to that thumb, first knuckle of the thumb, and also these couple folds in here. Stop obsessing over that. Okay, so this is basically our completed black and white figure, and we are now going to jump into color and start looking at how to glaze over this. So the first thing I do is get rid of the gray. So I'm just going to duplicate this, set this to color, and we covered the theory of this in part 1. But let's fix the shape of this arm here. Okay. Clip that down to the layer, and then I'll color balance it to give a cool undertone to my my skin shade. Now keep in mind that this reference does not have color on it, so I'll just be making these up, but there are still some notes that I'll address on color zones of the body. and how to build up glazes of warm and cool colors. So I put the cool undertone of color first, just so that it's sort of as I glaze warm colors over it, there's a playfulness, and I can erase colors and the blue will show up more, or I can layer complementary colors or colors that will harmonize with it on top and create all sorts of interesting effects. So the first color I like to glaze on is red, and so for this figure I'll go with like a pretty standard Caucasian skin tone. I think she's Caucasian from the but anyways, so reds will appear in areas where a lot of blood flows through, so, and where sun tends to get to. So if you have a tan, it'll be on the tanned areas, and where blood flows through, those will be joints and things like that. So I like to put some red around the neck, because you have a lot of blood that goes to the head, the neck and chest area. Ears can never be too red, neither can noses. Cheeks, I keep red off the jaw and off the forehead, because in bonier places, like places with really shallow skin, like the forehead, will tend to be a little more yellowed, or have a little more yellow, but you can also have quite a bit of blood flowing through like knuckles and stuff and knees, so you'll have some more red. So around the knees I'll add some red, or around the elbows, wrists, definitely hands and feet. The bottoms of legs tend to be a little redder as well, just because I think gravity just pulls the blood down. And then and so I think I'll go with a warmer shadow, warmer shadows and cooler highlights. I think that will be my scheme, just because I feel like it. And then I like to add sort of red in the creases. When you have areas like in the sort of pit of the elbow, or anywhere skin will rub, they'll also be more red. And I think it just adds depth. Like already with the ribs, you can see how much depth that adds, just to add red in the crevices. And then of course you'll have red wherever the light is scattering through the skin. So you'll have reds as undertones where all the core shadows are, and on the very edge, on the edge of the silhouette. So there's not really a lot of places red doesn't exist, but you can add red pretty much everywhere, just you want to add it more in some places than others. And those places are the ones that I mentioned. So now the reds that show up in the core shadows, you have to be a little careful with them, or else you can make your figure look like they're made out of wax, or like really translucent plastic. But as we glaze other colors over, we can get some other tones. So okay, that's fine. So now we'll do some beiges. So pushing our tones a more, do the oranges and yellows. maybe I'll use, sometimes I'll use a cloudy, like a cloudy, I might use this actually, just for the hell of it. And again, my flow is quite low, so I get some transparency. And I'll just start to lay in some beiges, which will warm up quite a bit the areas I put them in. So remember, I want cool highlights and warm shadows, so I'm gonna put more into my shadow areas and less in the light areas. But because she's Caucasian, there are going to be some yellows and even greens. I'll introduce some greens in here on the skin, so you can see how warm the shadow area is getting because I layered red already, and now I'm adding in the orange. Especially in the reflected light, if the light is coming on, hitting the skin and then reflecting back onto the skin, those areas will get really saturated. So I'll go even with a more orange red into this area here, because this is sort of where light is hitting and bouncing off into it, as well as in here. Not so much here because this is the ground reflecting up, but yeah, in areas like this, and definitely here. So these, I'm just like bumping the saturation, and I'm also exaggerating this quite a bit. But what's nice is that because all these colors are on other layers, if it's just too crazy, I can just tone it down by dropping the opacity of the layer. But I don't know, I like bright colors. And right, I want to add some vibrance to the skin. It's also nice to give some saturation to the edge of the cast shadows. This adds a lot of depth. There. Okay, so far we've only had the blue. The blue undertones are the only cool colors that we've had in here. So now this is looking real orange, real red, and so I'm gonna start introducing back some cooler colors actually to finish off. And it's gonna get red. Evening some of these things out. And actually the hair is going to stay quite desaturated because she has dark hair. So I'm just going to erase some of that, warm away. Okay, so now we have most of our warms and our cool color. And what's nice about this technique, as I mentioned in part 1, is that you can change the hue of the undertone. So I'm just pulling up my hue saturation on the blue layer I had, and as I change the hue, you know, if I make it more purple or more red or more orange or more green, you can see what that's doing to the tone of the figure where I left some of the areas transparent. You can see that more clearly if I lower the opacity of the layer. And you can see just by those And those couple little adjustments, we're starting to get a pretty realistic skin tone. But so I'm going to drop that, and I'm going to merge these two together. And so once you have your color scheme basically laid out, your color areas, you can go in and just color pick from around, or introduce new colors if you want. But I'm just going to color pick these different areas and smooth out some of the harsher transitions, and yeah, just play around, shift those colors around. And if I want more saturated, I can just pick a saturated color and add it on. Because the only thing you're picking is the color, right? You're not picking a value or anything else. So even if I pick a dark in here and draw, I'm only picking the color of the dark. If I want to pick a dark red, and it'll lay on more red. So this is where you can really start to play and add a nice interplay of warms and cools, and almost show the different layers of the skin, because skin, there's multiple layers. There's the epidermal, and then there's subdermal fat. You have small veins that run through the surface. Add saturation in here, in the neck. Also, it gets quite orange. Just by the light scattering through the hair, where the hair meets the skin, either on the forehead or, all around the scalp. A little less saturated here. See how much quicker it is to colorize than it is to to paint up all the values, but that way, that's the way I like to do it. I find I get the most control out of that, and also in a production setting, because I work in the game industry as a concept artist. If I'm working on an illustration or a character design, it's sort of faster to block something out in black and white, or it's easier to control your stuff in black and white. So if I need to present to a client or an art director, to do that in black and white is a lot faster. And then color after, like it's just part of the pipeline. But I find it's really applicable to my personal artwork as well. Especially these figure studies. And then add a little more saturation on the ears. You just have to pay attention that you don't want to disrupt the edges. Like, you don't want to be too messy with your with where the colors bleed in. So when there's a really sharp edge like this on the shoulder, you don't really want to do this sort of thing where you have pink here and then it kind of drags in, but it has nothing to do with the context of this color. So, if you're adding color over, it can be a little laborious, but just to, be careful of your edges and sort of mimic the brushwork that you put down underneath. I'm pretty happy with this. So I'm gonna merge that. Actually, I'm going to play around just a little with it and see what. So see some other options it can give me. So if I pull up my color balance, I can play with the colors of the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights independently. If I wanted to, make the highlights a lot warmer, or a lot cooler, yeah, you can just play around without destroying your value structure. But I'm just gonna stick to something pretty neutral overall, something like this, and then I'm just gonna colorize the background really quickly. So I like to colorize it as the complementary, like it's sort of very desaturated version of the complementary color of the skin. So the skin overall here is pretty pink and orange, but there's sort of purple blue undertones to it. So the background I'll give a little bit more of a purple, a blue purple tinge to it, just really subtly, and that'll sort of make everything pop, I think. And then the last thing we'll address is the hair. So I'll give this a little bit of a brown shade, and maybe some yellow, more yellow or orange highlights. So here, and maybe just a couple. Oh, too strong. Oh, nearly. Okay. Just a couple streaks of a little some. Okay. Now just variation to make it interesting. And okay, the last thing I wanted to talk about with this stage is how to consider your background when you're painting a figure. So skin, like all other materials, actually I'm gonna merge all this down. So skin, like all other materials, has some pretty intrinsic or some intrinsic properties to them, and in nature, all materials have they have a roughness, they have a local value and a local color. Some materials are pure reflection, like metal, but anyways, skin is a basic material. It's not a metal, and when all basic materials respect the law of Fresnel, and Fresnel is when as light approaches a grazing angle of a form. So if you have a sphere, right, and as light approaches, so a grazing angle would be like an angle that just skips off the side. So that would be the contour of the object, where it's a really, really shallow angle. The surface will become more reflective, and you see this really prominently in water, where you look far away and the water is super reflective, and you look close and you can see into the water. But it's on all objects, all sorts of spheres, or all sorts of all objects, all materials. So when your background changes, to have your figure sit well in the background, you can use the colors of the background and sort of layer the surrounding, like the perimeter of your figure with some of those colors, just to let it sort of melt into the background easier. So here I'm going to create one more clipping mask, and this is something you can do with any background you have, whether it be bright or green or whatever. It doesn't really matter, but you just color pick from the background, and with a soft brush you just graze over the edge of the figure, and that'll sort of let the it'll sort of make the figure recess or be pushed back into the background. And you can do this to different amounts. So on the face, I want it to really recede into the background. So I'm almost gonna like almost smoking it out, like fogging it out. And the same thing for the arm here, is I'm gonna layer on quite a bit of that color. And same for the arm down here. So this would sort of be, it's exaggerated, but it's just a way of letting your figure melt into the background more. So you can see here there's like a sharp angle around it, and here it sort of melts away. And I'll do this under here, on the shadow, and it's a little more, you can see it a little more in the shadow areas, but even in the light, I'll add some of this colors to make the edges a little less sharp. And then I'll just erase away where I really don't want that sort of thing happening. So I'm just taking away from some of the more abrasive edges. And finally, let's do soft light. I'll give this a little bit of a motion blur. So that's a little less harsh. And in the background, I'll do a little bit more brushwork, and then we'll call it done. Take some of this color in the shadow. Merge that down. So for the values of the background, I kind of go with dark. So if the light is coming from here, that means that the light will sort of light up this area more than this area. So here I do dark, and then here I do light. So, and you sort of gradate from one side to the other, and that sort of, so this sort of goes dark against light, and here you have and then here again you have dark against a lighter background. So that's what I'm doing with this brushwork, to give a little bit more volume to the space. can also introduce even some of the colors in the figure, because you never, as soon as you introduce a new color, you want it to show up a little bit all over the place, not just in the one zone, at least in a painterly, in a more painterly piece. So I'm just adding some subtle color variation in that, and then in the background here, I'm gonna add a couple beiges, some quick work here, and then see I brighten up this area, and it sort of makes the elbow pop up some fur behind here. So you can and that sort of makes you sort of pick the areas of highest contrast. If you want the head to really recede back, you can darken up the background, and it'll do that. It'll sort of like, yeah, you can just make different areas pop. And I'll take a soft brush to go over some areas lightly, sort of create really subtle glow around the top of my figure. This is sort of the bloom we were talking about. So it's just a really soft layer of light. That, and then sort of vignetting one side and the bottom here. Something like that. And that basically makes for a completed figure painting. Could always go in more detail, and you know, this feet aren't really nice, so I might block them out a little more, or I don't know. But yeah, so that's it for this figure painting demo. I hope that you could get something out of it. Hope you learned a lot about how to bring a figure form to life, and generating or creating different shapes, pushing and pulling forms, and took away from the lighting and the color. And yeah, so I'm just gonna quickly touch up one or two of these areas, and let's call it done. But okay. I really don't want to call it done yet, but that's life. I've got 2 more of these to do to complete the series, and yeah, that should be ample for you figure painting artists to get off the floor and get to painting. So thanks a lot. Hope this was helpful. I hope you learned a lot, and we'll see you in part 3. So ciao.